Today we are going to look at the last section of chapter 5, which is looking at domain and range in the real world. So if you remember from earlier in this chapter, domain represented the set of all of your x values and range represented the set of all of your y values. For understanding domain and range in real world problems, though, we really need to think of domain and range as dependent and independent variables. So the dependent variable depends on or is decided by the independent variable. So your independent variable is what you guys are accustomed to being x. X gets to be whatever it wants to be. And then when we substitute it into the equation and simplify, then that tells us what y is. So the y value depends on what we substitute in for x. So let's look at a couple of examples here and try to see how this works. So on this first example, it says, Kevin is a runner. His time to finish a race varies with the number of training miles he runs before that race. Which is the dependent variable? So like we said before, your dependent variable would be your y variable. So y is typically waiting for x to decide what it wants to be. So this is the y, or the output variable. So his time to finish the race varies with the number of training miles he runs. So in other words, the number of training miles that he does is going to decide or impact what his time is to finish the race. So the independent variable, the x, what he is in control of is the number of training miles. And then the output, the result of that, the y, would be his time to finish the race. So our dependent variable here would be time to finish the race. Moving down to B. On B it says, Carmen has a part-time job entering data in a computer. The amount of data she enters affects her pay at the end of the week. What is the independent variable? So independent, we said that was our x value. That's what we get to decide. So if Carmen is looking for the independent variable, the thing that she is in control of, then that would be the amount of data that she enters. So that's the part that she is in control of, and then that decides how much she gets paid. So the amount of pay then is her dependent variable. In this last example on this screen, we are working from an equation. So you have the equation n equals -4 plus 3k. And it says that determines the value of the output n as a function of the input k. So if we remember, our input values from earlier in this chapter were always our x's, and our output values were always our y values. So it's asking us which one is the independent variable. Well, from the past two examples, we said that the independent was what came first, which is our x. So in this case, that is the variable k. All right, moving on to the next slide. So on this slide, we have some definitions to fill in at the top. The independent variable is the x value, which corresponds to the blank. And then the dependent variable is the y value, which corresponds to the blank. So on the last screen, we said that independent values were our x values and that those corresponded to the domain. And then the dependent variable, which is your y value then, corresponds to your range. So we have domain and range coming into play here again for us as we look at this next example. So in example 2 here, it says, Chang is a software salesman. Let P be Chang's total pay in dollars, and let N be the number of copies of Math is Fun he has sold. Chang has 140 copies available to sell. Suppose that, so important here, they're giving us an equation. So if they give us an equation, we probably want to notice that equation. So this equation here, it tells us P as a function of N for these available copies. So in other words, this function says his pay is equal to 40 times the number of copies sold plus $2,400. Now down here, they want us to identify the correct description of the values in both the domain and the range, and then choose a set of numbers. So we have these possible sets of values down here that we can use for domain and range. So domain, again, those are your independent values, your X values where you would be plugging into the equation. So if we look up here, we can see that where we would substitute into this equation is where we see N. And if we read back up here, it says N is the number of copies that he has sold. So that means that our domain variable is number of copies that he has sold, which means that our range variable has to be the other one, the output value, which would be his total pay. So the number of copies that he has sold determines his pay. Or in other words, his pay is dependent upon how many copies he can sell. So now down here, we have to determine which of these number sets represent the correct set of values that would work for our domain, for the number of copies that he has sold. So let's go through our options here before we pick. So our first option is the set of all real numbers greater than 140. So all real numbers would include fractions and decimals. This one says the set of all real numbers from 0 to 2,400. This one, the set of all real numbers from 140 to 8,000. So the first three sets of numbers all include the option for fractions and decimals. If we're talking about copies of a magazine, then those three options are not going to make sense because we're not going to sell somebody part of a magazine. We could rip it in half, but nobody is going to want to buy it then. So hopefully one of these other three sets of values down here will be better. So this one here that starts with 2,400 goes from 2,400 up to 8,000. And if you look, it's going in jumps of 40. But we were told up here in the problem that Chang has 140 copies to sell. So that's it. That's all he has. This next one starts at 40 and goes up by increments of 40 all the way to 2,400. Again, it's important to keep in mind that he only has 140 copies to sell. So then this last one starts at 0, so that would mean that Chang sells nothing, and it goes up to 140, and it counts by ones. So this would be our correct choice for representation of the domain, the number of copies he can sell. He can sell anything from 0 up to 140. At 140, he's sold out in increments of 1. So now if I think about total pay, there's going to be sort of a minimum and a maximum for Chang's total pay. So the minimum amount that he would make would be if he sold 0 copies of the magazine. Well, since I have this equation here, then I could figure out the minimum amount that he could make. So the minimum amount that he would make would be found by him selling 0 magazines, which would mean that N equals 0. So if P was equal to 40 times 0 plus 2,400, so if I simplify this then, I know that 40 times 0 is going to give me 0. So I have 0 plus 2,400. And 0 plus 2,400 would be 2,400. So that means that the minimum amount that Chang is going to make is going to be $2,400. So if I look over at my choices, I know that I need one of these options that starts with 2400. So that means that my only option then would be this option here that shows a start of 2400. The rest of them don't start there, but that's his minimum amount. This one starts at 140. This one starts at 0. This one starts at 140. And this one here starts at 40. So we go from 2400 all the way up to 8,000. So that value of 8,000 is how much money Chang would make if he sold out. So meaning he sold 140 total magazines.